You're standing at the entrance of a Victorian workhouse because there's nowhere else left to go. And the strange part is, this place was built to make your life worse. So the question is, why would a society design help that feels like punishment? Because from here, it doesn't look like help at all. It looks like a warning. And everything you're about to see starts long before anyone reaches this door. This is Britain, early 1800s. And before the workhouse, something is already going wrong. It starts with bread. Not symbolic, not abstract, just bread. For most families, it isn't part of life, it is life. And when the price rises, slowly at first, to the point where it almost doubles, war with France drags on, year after year, approximately 22 years of war. Trade tightens, grain gets scarce, food gets expensive, and at first, people adapt, because they always do, because you assume it's temporary, right? But then something doesn't make sense. The war ends, trade reopens, people assume cheap grain will return, prices should fall. It really starts to tap into something interesting, a concept called normacy bias. The tendency to assume that things will eventually go back to normal the way they were, even when there's no real sign that they will. There's a lot of studies on disasters and long-term crises which show that people often delay reacting for exactly this reason. They wait, hoping the situation will correct itself rather than escalate. With that in mind, let's get to the Corn Laws. The Corn Laws. Imports are restricted deliberately, so food stays expensive, and when people expected it to go back to normal. On paper, it's stability, but stability depends on where you stand. If you own land, it might look like it's going to make you a profit, but if you don't, things are probably going to cost a lot more to survive. It traps you. And this is the moment it changes, because now it's not just bad luck, it's a decision about who carries the pressure. But even that, it isn't the breaking point. Something else happens far away. A volcano erupts. Mount Tambora. No one in England sees it, but they feel it. The sky fades, the summers turn cold, crops often fail. Food prices rise again, and Jane Austen writes in 1816, "I begin to think it will never be fine again." It doesn't sound like weather anymore, it sounds like something settling in. And still, this isn't the worst part, because something quieter is also happening, something harder to survive. The land is disappearing. For generations, poor families relied on common land, not for comfort, for survival. A cow grazing, collecting wood, just enough to stay afloat. It wasn't security, I guess, but it was a buffer. And then it's gone, enclosed, privatised, fenced off, and with it, the last safety net disappears. So now, if wages fall, you fall with them. And wages do fall, because suddenly there are a lot more people. England's population surges 9 million to 12 million in just 20 years. That's not growth, that's certainly competition for a lot of people, for work, for food, for survival. And at the same time, work itself is changing. Machines spread, factories expand. Skills, unfortunately, lose value. Workers become replaceable. It seems when we think about it, beneath all this is something shaping how people respond. When resources tighten like this, the mindset shifts to what psychologists often call the scarcity mindset, a concept that researchers have found that when people are short on money, their focus narrows to what's urgent. You stop thinking long term because you don't care so much, because you don't have the space to. Over time, it creates something called tunneling, where everything outside immediate survival just fades into the background. So people don't step back and to question what's happening. They adapt, they tolerate the situations just to make do. It becomes harder and harder to challenge the system because, they're just focusing on survival. With that in mind, let's look at one person's experience of this change, Joseph, a ribbon and wool comber. A few years earlier, he earns 12 shillings a week, sometimes 15. Not easy, but enough. Enough for bread and maybe some broth on a good day, to hire a room for the night, to shelter his family, perhaps even some fuel for fire to keep him warm. Look, I'm not saying this is above the poverty line, but then it changes. More workers, simpler tasks, cheaper labour. Children are even hired. And Joseph's wage drops. 12 becomes 9, 9 becomes 7. And somewhere around 8, there's a line, invisible, but absolute. Above it, life holds together. Below it, it just doesn't. Now every decision costs something else. Deciding between food or heat, rent or meals. Nothing dramatic happens. That's the problem. Everything just shrinks. Bread gets thinner, meals get smaller. The children notice, not through numbers, but through questions. Is there more? And sometimes there just isn't any more food. Imagine if one day you drastically lose hours in your job. What compromises do you think you'd be able to make? How long do you think you'd be able to hold up with just your savings? Because at this point, something else is changing. Across Britain, thinkers like Thomas Malthus are reshaping how people understand poverty. They argue that population will always outgrow resources, and that too much support can make the problem worse, not better. With that unfortunate thinking, the distinction hardens between deserving and undeserving poor. And from that comes the principle that will define a new system. Relief must never be comfortable or even equal to the life of the lowest paid labourer. It has to be worse, not by accident, but unfortunately by design. The idea becomes central to the 1834 Poor Laws, what officials say less eligibility. The rule is that conditions inside the workhouse must be harsher than life on the outside, so only the most desperate would enter. And that changes the question. Not how do we relieve poverty, but how do we prevent reliance on relief? And once you change the question, the answer becomes very different, because now poverty isn't something to be helped. In the Victorian mindset, is something to be managed, disciplined, controlled. And this shift isn't just political, it's psychological. Once people start asking why individuals are poor instead of what conditions have created their poverty, they fall maybe into something psychologists called fundamental attribution error. It's a simple pattern on how we think. When something goes wrong in someone else's life, people can explain it by who they are, their choices, their effort, their character. We can underestimate everything around them, the pressure, the limits, the lack of options. So poverty stops looking like a situation and starts looking like a decision. It becomes something attributed to this decision and, unfortunately, easier to justify control. Hard rules, harsh conditions, punitive systems. Because if the problem is associated with behaviour, the solution becomes the correction. Responsibility shifts away from systems and on to individuals. And now you can see it now. When people struggle, the conversation often drifts from changing conditions to questioning character, unfortunately. Because once poverty is defined that way, the solution doesn't look like support anymore. And everything leads here, to that door, the workhouse. But the goal isn't to help people inside it, it's to make sure no one wants to enter this door. Relief becomes conditional, controlled, and more importantly, worse than the lowest paid work outside. So people avoid it, not because they don't need help, but because they're afraid of it. And that fear is the design of the whole system working, because systems don't need force if they feel legitimate to people. So now, step inside. You enter your name, everything you own is taken. Your clothes are replaced, coarse, identical, forgettable, and immediately something changes. You're no longer seen as a person in difficulty, you're seen as a category. Families are separated, men, women, and children, not because they have to be, but because that's the rule. The architecture was actually specifically designed to separate families, and the rules, once written, stop needing reasons. The day becomes predictable: bell, wake, count, meals, work, silence, and the work itself is strange. Stone breaking, oakum picking, bone crushing, repetitive, exhausting, pointless. Not designed to create value, but designed to feel like punishment. Because if it felt meaningful, it might feel acceptable, and it might defeat the point. Paper, the food looks sufficient. Bread, gruel, maybe even some thin broth. Around 1,300 to 1,600 calories a day, if they're lucky. Sometimes more on paper, less in reality. For most people, this is a diet below caloric maintenance, which means it's less calories than the body needs for its basic functioning. It doesn't produce immediate collapse, but it forces the body into a constant deficit. In modern terms, this is starvation. Now consider the labourer, because at times work is physically hard. Stone breaking, oakum picking, even things like laundry, long hours, little rest. And at that level, most people are running on a deficit, always tired, always hungry. It isn't that there are no nutrients. There's bread, some grain, and occasional dairy if they get really lucky, just enough to sustain life, but it's limited. Almost no fruit, very little meat if any. Vegetables, when they appear, are plain, overboiled, and pretty scarce, and this is not as dependable as it looks. Workhouse food was often stretched further still, watered down, bulked out, or adulterated. Underpaid masters sometimes colluded with suppliers and contractors to make the ingredients go further than they should. Before effective enforcements of the public health laws later in the century, such practices were really common and seldom checked. So what reaches the plate may be thinner, poorer, and less nourishing than the official ration suggests, which was already really small. And so the body doesn't fail at once. It wears down slowly. Weakness, weight loss, anemia, deficiencies that creep up over time. Not starvation you always see, but the kind of thing that happens in plain sight and is written off as discipline. And then something breaks. Let's look at the story of one workhouse, Andover. Men were required to crush animal bones to make fertilizer, and they were starving. They were working in a room using iron bars to crush the bones by hand. Apparently, the smell of the decaying bones was absolutely putrid. Witnesses described what followed, of seeing them gnaw the meat from the bones. There are also accounts of members in the workhouse scrambling and quarrelling amongst the bones. The official investigation later found serious mismanagement by those responsible, unnecessary harshness in administration, and failures in oversight and supervision. All this happened inside a system that was meant to be monitored, regulated, and approved. Let's be honest though, the workhouse created exactly what it aimed to produce, a life so desperate, so stripped back, that no one would ever choose it unless there was no choice left. And now, step outside, stand at that door again, look at it carefully, because it doesn't feel accidental anymore, it feels constructed. People experienced war, policy, land, weather, work, each narrowing the path, closing the exits, removing the alternatives, until there's no decision left, only a direction, and a door that was never meant to feel like help.